Okay, we are going to do a little talk about Paul Emil Breitenfeld, who was born November 25th, 1924. As I'm born November 23rd, I kind of got an idea about his personality, and everything I've read about him suggests, yeah, we're both Sagittarians, no doubt about that. A little bit of confusion about his heritage. Some people feel that he was what we might call a non-practicing Jew, and that had been his family dynamic for generations. His father was Emil Breitenfeld, and of course Paul took the middle name from his father. He's raised in a fairly musical home in that his father was an accomplished keyboard player, both piano and organ, who played gigs around San Francisco area, California, and did a lot of work in theaters during the silent movie era. He provided, the music was quite common, primarily on organ. A lot of these big theaters were equipped with gigantic pipe organs just to make that whole thing really, really exciting for the audience. The father also was a composer and arranger, and he wrote music for publication as well as scores that were used with larger ensembles that were playing again in theaters for silent and talking film. So his father was on the cutting edge of what we might call scores for movies and the budding Hollywood infancy. Paul himself did not start playing until he was 12 years old, and his instrument was the clarinet, which he played from the time he was 12 until the time that he graduated high school. He went to San Francisco Polytechnical High School, and after that he went to San Francisco State College. As a freshman, he switched to alto saxophone. He auditioned for the Army Band, and he made it, and was assigned to a band right there in San Francisco. So he had a lot of good luck, at least up to that point. One of the people that he encountered while in the Army doing an audition was a pianist by the name of Dave Brubeck, who was assigned to the same musical unit as Paul. Paul, however, was never shipped overseas. And Dave Brubeck was sent away to Europe. And he served abroad in the military for 3 or 4 years. They didn't see each other again until the war was over. By that time, when Paul came out of the Army, he decided that he did not like his name. He's around there playing gigs here and there, and people are having a hard time with his name. There was a popular singer at that time on the radio named Ray Desmond, I think, and Paul said, I like that name. It's unusual and it's sweet. I like it. So he changed his name from Paul Emil Breitenfeld to Paul Desmond. Now you know who we're talking about. Yeah, right. So he's playing gigs here and there, gigs here and there, here and there. And finally he connects with Dave Brubeck again. And they start playing little gigs at this little club and that little club and this little club. And there was always a little conflict between them because they were very, very different people. Dave was a settled down, fairly conservative, married man with one wife and 3 little kids. And Paul was a bohemian. He did it all. He had lots of addictions, including alcohol and an array of other party favorites, drugs. He was married once from 1947 to 1949. I think it lasted like 2 years. But Paul was also what they call a ferocious womanizer. Ferocious. He never let one get by if he could help himself. And he was a good-looking guy. He had that sweet sound, and so he used that to sharpen his lure and to help him, how shall we say, capture his game, because that's all it was to him, just something to do. He and Dave had a disagreement over a gig, and Dave fired him. And then Paul went back to the club owner to make sure that Dave could not continue to play the gig without him. So because Dave fired Paul, Dave himself and his entire band got fired from this club. This set up let's just say they had a pause in their relationship. And Dave was quite angry about it. And his instruction to his wife was, if he ever comes to my front door, do not let him in our house. I don't want that person near you or our kids. And I certainly don't want him near me. But Paul was quite engaging. He had that slick wit and tongue. And one day he is driving around and he hears the Dave Brubeck Trio on the radio. Now Paul is doing little gigs, he's doing okay, but he's not on the radio. So he decides, okay, in order for me to move myself up, I gotta get back with Dave. So he did what he had to do. He went to Dave's home. And as was his talent, he sweet-talked Dave's wife into letting him into the house, and she escorted him back into the backyard where, believe it or not, Dave Brubeck is in the backyard hanging up diapers. Let's just say the conversation went sideways real fast. But Dave was a gentleman. He didn't want to yell at his wife or anything, and the little kids all around. You don't want them crying. So it stayed at a simmer. They agreed to agree and disagree, but to come up with a contract. Now, Paul was quite crafty, because this contract only had one signature, and that was Dave. And the main purpose of the contract was that Dave could never fire him, period, ever. And Paul agreed that he would perform extra duties for Dave. As a result, he would do administrative duties for the band. He would do compositions and arranging and all that. And something else he agreed, he would serve as babysitter for Dave's 3 kids. Okay, your wife is standing there. She definitely needs a babysitter. She needs a break. And Paul has come up with the right combination of, how shall I say this, sweeteners to cause Dave to sign that contract. And so the band reconstituted itself. The Dave Dave Brubeck Trio became the Dave Brubeck Quartet with the addition of Mr. Paul Desmond. You could say the rest is history. They started playing gigs and quickly became one of the most popular gigs on the West Coast. And Dave was a good businessman because, jazz, you don't always get nice surroundings and healthy and this and that. And Dave, as I said, was a clean living kind of guy. And jazz clubs, not necessarily clean living things. A lot of loose women, a lot of alcohol, a lot of people out there with drugs and this and that. And Dave wanted to get away from that as much as he could. So some of the bigger gigs that the quartet played were at colleges. And recordings were made of these at Oberlin University in Ohio, at Ohio University, and at Michigan State University. Not only did he play gigs there among the several colleges that they did on their college tour, but they made recordings at those 3 schools. And so they are cultivating a younger audience of fans. And this gave them a fan base that is emerging with education, refinement, and eventually some money to buy recordings and whatnot. So Dave is taking care of business and Paul is helping him organize all this stuff, and it's going really, really well. And they're making all of these great recordings as well. The funny thing is, with all the recordings they made, the most popular single tune the Dave Brubeck Quartet ever recorded was a tune called Take 5. And as I prepared for this, I listened to that tune again and again and again because I listened to it so much as a kid. I hadn't listened for quite a few years. And yeah, it's marvelous. And I especially love the drum solo as performed by the masterful Joe Morello, who was the drummer in that group. Just masterful stuff. And the way Paul, how shall I say this, weaved in and out of the textures and times and harmonic polychords and rhythmic polyrhythms that Dave and the rhythm section are creating was just fabulous. And no one could do that improvisational counterpoint, which means you are improvising a melody against the melody. No one could do that better than Paul Desmond. So if Dave had not taken Paul back and signed that contract, Take 5 would never have happened. Yeah. And the popularity of that quartet, of course, was based on that that one tune and that album, About Time. So this is the beginning of a great run of hits, and for fans, critics, everyone, for Paul Desmond and the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Now, Paul always kept something else on the side. He was typical, as was Dave, of what we call the cool jazz. Not hot like Dizzy Gillespie and those guys, but cool like Chet Baker and Gary Mulligan, and even Miles Davis for a while. And this all came out of a legacy that was created by Lester Young long, long ago with his nice, smooth, easy, softer sound. Of course, Paul Desmond would credit Lee Konitz as being his #1 inspiration for his sound and his approach. But all of that, as I say, it really goes back to Lester Young. Without the blues that Lester put into everything. The cool jazz didn't have all that blues, because when you got all those flat 5s and flat 7s and flat 9s, it can't be cool, it's gotta be hot. So that's kind of how that whole thing went. Paul liked to work with a lot of different people. Chet Baker, a young trumpet player and singer, did a lot of great things together. Jim Hall, great guitarist, was a frequent collaborator with Paul Desmond, and some of his best recordings are done with Jim Hall, and great concerts, including a concert at the Half Note in New York City that was actually recorded, and is one of those celebrated recordings. Paul also, believe it or not, recorded with Milt Jackson, who I covered in a previous session, and the Modern Jazz Quartet, because as you remember, MJQ was doing a kind of a classical infused, softer, chamber-like jazz, which was closer to the West Coast cool jazz than it was to the East Coast hot jazz. So that also worked. And that concert, I believe, was done at Town Hall, a gigantic theater in New York, I think capacity of 1,500, sold out and was great, as was the concert with Jim Hall at the Half Note, sold out. So he's becoming very, very popular in his own right, alongside his popularity with the Dave Brubeck Quartet. He also had many collaborations with Jerry Mulligan, the great baritone saxophonist who was also West Coast cool jazz kind of guy. And they did 2 recordings together, Jerry Mulligan, Paul Desmond, and then an album that was called Two of a Mind. And two of a mind they were, because Jerry Mulligan was no angel. He was no Dave Brubeck. He had even more habits and liabilities than even Paul Desmond. All of the above. So they were very, very compatible in spirit, and maybe that is why they were compatible musically as well. And that last album they did, Two of a Mind, kind of suggests that they both realized that they were, as I like to say, two sides of the same coin. Paul continued to record with the Dave Brubeck Quartet until I think that ended somewhere in the 70s, when Dave decided to go into bigger pieces, suites, and more classical infused music, and bigger orchestrations, and etc. And Paul continued to do his small group stuff. Paul lived in New York, and Dave, of course, lived in California. So you had guys who liked two different worlds. Dave liked it in the country in California, and Paul liked it in the city in New York, where he could do what he liked to do, which was just about everything. Now, Paul was a chain smoker, smoked constantly, and he was also a big drinker. And Scotch whiskey, baby, that was him. So anytime you saw him, he was kind of like my father, a cigarette in one hand and a glass of Scotch in the other. That's the way he rolled. Late in his life, well, his life, he didn't live but into his 50s, but you know, around 50, he was diagnosed with cancer. And he had this incredible sense of humor. And his response, when he was told that you have very serious lung cancer and it's probably going to take you out of here, he was like, oh my God, you mean my kidneys are okay? After all that liquor I drank? Hey, I'm really happy about that. Kidneys are okay. So he had that weird sense of humor. Eventually, the cancer won. But despite all of his liabilities, his habits, his bohemian ways, he had a really good heart. When Dave came back in later years and his kids were grown up, those little kids whose diapers he was hanging out, back in the 50s, were now musicians themselves, bass, keyboard, I think, and saxophone. He brought Paul Desmond back to play with his sons and him, and they did some tours and recordings and whatnot, and it wasn't long after that Paul finally died from the cancer. A couple of things that shows his heart, because sometimes you have to look past a man's habits and look at his heart. Number one, Take 5 was the biggest thing that had been done by Dave Brubeck. A lot of money made on that one tune. And Paul wrote it. And he was smart enough to retain the copyright for it. So he got all the money from that tune. In his will, he directed that every penny after his death from Take 5 will go to the Red Cross. He never served in a war, but he had a lot of friends that had left, like Dave, and didn't come back. So he was very appreciative of the work of the Red Cross, so he gave them all the proceeds from Take 5 to this very day. The other thing he did was he willed his personal saxophone to one of Dave's sons. Yes, he did that. And he had a big ballroom grand piano in his little apartment in New York, and they had a hard time figuring how to get it here and get it there. It was right near this club he wanted to give it to. So in order to take possession of the piano, the guy had to invigorate, reconstruct, tear down walls, everything to make room for that grand piano. But he wanted Paul's piano in his club, and that too happened. And it stayed in that club until the club closed a few years ago. Paul Desmond is quite a controversial figure in that there are those of us who like the harder jazz who kind of frowned on that soft, cool jazz kind of thing that he did, but you could not take from him his incredible talent. And so although people may not have preferred what he did, everyone had a lot of respect for what he did. The instrument he gave to Brubeck was his Selmer, a super balanced action alto saxophone that goes back in 1951. I think he bought it right at the time that he rejoined Dave Brubeck and the trio became the quartet. So that went to the Brubeck family. He was a masterful saxophone player, and aside from his very sweet, clear tone, he was known for playing the highest notes ever on the alto sax, his altissimo high note. Altissimo register was just incredible, and all in that balanced action and a hard rubber mouthpiece with a Rico 3.5 reed. Now, before I end this, I gotta tell you about Ricos, because I know there's people here who are going, Rico, man, that's a student reed. Yeah, you're right, but they're cheap. And you can buy them by the box. And I've known professional woodwind players who use Ricos. And they would buy the whole box, and if there were 20 reeds in it, you see them trying to read and throwing it away. Trying to read and throwing it away. But then they would try one that worked, and they would swear that the ones that worked were better than any of the other more reputable reeds, higher priced reeds available. And I remember playing with a clarinet player who would sit there every concert with his box of Ricos and go through them and throw them and go through them more, and then finally he'd find one that worked. He had a big smile on his face, and that's what Paul Desmond did as well. Very particular, but also frugal. He had to have money for his cigarettes and liquor and for all those women he was chasing. So let's focus on the music. The sound, unmistakable. The swing, light, airy, but unmistakable. Control of the altissimo register, impeccable. He lived the life of a bohemian. He enjoyed every minute of his life. He had a good sense of humor. And even when he was faced with his own mortality, he was able to make a joke and see humor in his situation. Go listen to some Paul Desmond, who started life as Paul Emo Bradenfield in 1924 and left us in 1977. Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure delivering this one because I learned a lot about someone I've known about my whole life, but had never dug into who this wonderful musician was. Thank you very much.